Hi, everybody, and welcome to Leadership Community. During this ministry year from September through May, we're actually going through a series titled Creating a Disciple-Making Culture. We've been through steps 1 and 2. Today, we're going to look at step 3, which is on raising the temperature. Now, step number 3 is to recognize that once we get people in the right kinds of relationships or in the right kind of context where that life change can be triggered, we need to make sure that the right dynamics are taking place within that context. So step number 3 is to raise the spiritual temperature. And there are 2 different areas that I want you to think about. One which we've already kind of had some exposure to, and that's logistical dynamics. In our half-page version of our discipleship guide, I use the acronym FIT for frequency, intensity, and time. And so I want to quickly review that and then spend the rest of our time on the more important relational dynamics that need to be going on if we're going to raise the temperature, okay? So first of all, logistical dynamics. The F in the acronym FIT stands for frequency. That's really all about the frequency with which the group meets. We recommend 3 out of every 4 weeks over a semester, and then you take a break. And then you come back for another semester, the same frequency, and you take a break over the summer. Now, when you only go once every other week, and then if somebody misses a week during that month, you only see each other once a month, and of course that begins to, again, abort the purposes of making disciples. It doesn't even create community. I asked one of our small group leaders just last week, I said, hey, how was your experience with the Rediscovering Discipleship, the integrated series? The first thing out of his mouth was to say, wow. He said, you know what, meeting every week was really valuable. Well, yeah, because that's one of the key dynamics, frequency, and then secondly, intensity. Now, intensity refers to, are we allowing people to become passive, to simply show up, watch some Christian video, as good as it could be, some good Christian teaching, but then there's just some interaction, some processing together, and we all leave. Now compare that to what we did this past semester, the Discovery Bible Method. And in that, it's kind of like an introductory inductive study in which you ask questions of the text, and then you have to process the answers in dialogue with other people. And then there's even a question that says, what is God calling on you to obey or to apply from our study today? And then if you come back the next week and you hold accountable everyone, you see what's just happened is you're going to raise the intensity level significantly, but in a safe way, because people are going to now have a much better chance of moving to discipleship. If discipleship is someone who is following Jesus, who is being changed by Jesus, and who is on mission for Jesus, you see, that kind of engagement, that kind of application is going to bump things up significantly. So frequency, intensity, and then thirdly is time. I'll only say this about that. We'll probably get a better picture of that after our second semester, because a full year of focusing on this discipleship or rediscovering discipleship, I think will make more progress than maybe we've seen in a lot of other opportunities or studies that we've gone through. So, having said that about the logistical dynamics that need to take place if we're going to raise the temperature, now let's look at the relational side of it. And I want to talk about the relational dynamics that go on in a group. And I want to frame them under a couple of shifts that we want to make in our own thinking. Now, I will tell you, I recently did an interview with the Bonhoeffer Project, and they asked me, what have you learned about discipleship over the years? And one of the questions they asked me was, who discipled you, and what did you, what was it that discipled you? And I told them, I said, well, it's not like I went through a class and got discipled, or read a manual or a book or a couple of books and got discipled. I did all of those things, but when I look back and answer the question, how was I discipled, I would say it was through a series of friendships, really great friendships. Because it was in those friendships, you see, that certain things are caught rather than taught. You might remember a number of weeks ago I talked about a friend, Bozo, his nickname was Bozo. His real name was Behzad Pakazigi. He was an Iranian. And we got to be friends, and that friendship, as I look back on it, was catalytic in so many ways because I saw things, I saw characteristics in Bozo that I wanted to have. You see, it was more of an imitation than it was an information exchange. Now, that's the first shift that I want you to see. It's a shift from information to imitation, or it's valuing imitation over information. Information is, of course, important, but imitation is even more so. Now, let me just make that point and drive it home from Scripture itself. When you look at Jesus-style discipleship, particularly as it's practiced by the Apostle Paul, I want to read a series of verses to you. We'll put them on the screen, and I want you to just note the key words here. First of all, as Paul writes to the Corinthians, he says, "Follow my example as I follow the example of Christ." And then again, he says, "Therefore, I urge you to imitate me." Now notice the key words: follow, example, imitate. Richly imitative words. Now, Paul writes to the Philippians, he says, "Join together in following my example, brothers and sisters. And just as you have us as a model, keep your eyes on those who live as we do." Notice again, you have us as a model. Keep your eyes on those who live as we do. Notice again the rich imitation language. Well, again, in Philippians, whatever you've learned or received or heard or seen in me, in other words, in our life-on-life relationship, put it into practice. And then finally here in Thessalonians, and I'm just giving you a quick overview. In the first Thessalonian letter, he says, "You became imitators of us and of the Lord." And then again in the second epistle, he said, "You yourselves know how you ought to follow our example." Now the language of imitation, example, follow, imitate, model, live as we do, learn, received, heard, seen in me. This is rich language of imitation. Now, you might not know this about me, but I am a certified driver education teacher from West Virginia University. I know that could come as a shock to some of you. I think some of my skills have gotten rusty, but that was a long time ago. I'm sure that my certification has expired now 50 years later. But my last semester at WVU, I just needed, I needed a few more hours. I had to get at least 12 hours, and I had everything else, all my other requirements done. And so I looked for a couple of, fun classes. I took one in scuba diving and another one in driver education. I was in the College of Education, so planning to be a teacher and a coach, I thought it could come in handy someday. And the way they did it, they created a program in the community where people from the community could come in, and the students in the class who were learning to be certified instructors would, take them out for the practicum part of it. Now, I ended up with a lady. I would say she was probably in her early 40s. She had taken the written test 2 times, 10, 15 years ago, and passed it. But the 2 times she took her actual driver test, she failed it miserably. In fact, I found out later, they didn't tell me this till later, that she'd actually gotten in an accident. She'd actually pulled out of the driveway and backed into another car, which ended immediately her driving test. Now, the reason she let all those years go by was she'd been traumatized by this whole thing, and I think finally her husband said, "Okay, I got to stop driving you all around here." So she took it, but it was interesting because she'd read the manual, and so now she was in a different kind of context. And, I was just, very patient with her, understanding that she had some issues with this. And so I'd say, "Okay, here's what I want you to do. I just want you to follow me. I'm going to put my hands at, remember this, 10 and 2 o'clock. I'm going to, look right. I'm going to look left. I'm going to look in my rear view mirror. I'm going to look, in my rear view mirror over me. Then I'm going to release the brake, and I'm going to begin to go back. Okay, and I would just kind of talk her through it. And as I did that, an amazing thing began to happen. Her comfort level began to grow. She got more and more, easy with the whole thing. And the reason was, you see, because we learn best from imitation, not information. Well, shift number one then, we want to value imitation over information. Now, a second shift is we want to value relationships over program. There's a tendency, you see, for all of us to think that if we offer a series of classes, like discipleship pathway groups, and people go through that, then they say, well, yeah, I was discipled. I've been discipled. Now, if anything, I hope you'll remember this. The purpose of those, quote, classes, which I don't even call them classes, I call them groups, because I try to transform them into interactive experiences for the purposes I'm going to explain to you here momentarily. But we say this is a framework and this is a foundation of information that'll be helpful to you, but you're going to have to keep revisiting this, and you want to do it in the context of relationships. You see, not in the sterile environment of a classroom or academia or something like that. Now, let me give you a little formula that I think will maybe help as you think about, valuing relationships over program. Think of the initials REI. It stands for relationship, experience, and information. And if you put that in the form of a formula, relationships plus experience plus information, it equals transformation. Now, relationships, you see, are the highest priority because that's the critical context in which God does the deepest work in the core of our being. That's where, you see, things are being imitated, and that's where we're, being impacted by what's not just what's taught, but by what's caught. And then experiences, shared experiences with people are what continue to deepen and evolve the relationship. And then finally, the information element is richest when it's in the format or in the context of relationships and experiences. Now, the key to good discipleship, effective discipleship, is this, that you get the right balance and order to those three components. So, for instance, if you lead with information and then experiences and then relationships, you're going to get a very different kind of product. You're going to end up with a Pharisee more likely than not. I think some of the most effective discipleship that I did was back in the 70s and the 80s, and I don't think I knew what I was doing at the time. I can explain it now, but then I just sort of stumbled into it. But I was working with professional athletes, and of course they have this tremendous platform where you can get them to go out and share their faith in lots of different contexts. And so we created something called AIA, which stands for Athletes in Action, mini weeks. And we would go to towns around Pennsylvania, New York, Eastern Ohio. We'd go to Altoona and Erie and Jamestown, New York. And we did over 300 assemblies of what were called superstar competition assemblies, in which these pro athletes, Steelers, would compete in volleyball game, relay race, home run derby with a wiffle ball, packed into a 45-minute assembly. I would MC it. The guys would come up and they'd share a brief testimony and so forth. Then we'd go out and normally spend the time in a classroom answering questions and so forth. It's hard to imagine that this could happen in public schools today, but back in the 70s and 80s, this is what we were doing. Now, it wasn't what was happening there as they were sharing their faith that was so crucial in the discipleship of those athletes. What was critical is we were doing life together. I had those guys for 2 and 3 days. We're living at the hotel. We're doing meals together. We're driving around together. We're sharing our lives. And it was in the context of those shared experiences and those growing relationships, you see, that what I would say in terms of any kind of discipleship training or information was put on steroids, because it went way beyond a kind of a sterile talking head in a classroom setting. Well, shift number 2 then is we value relationships over program. And finally, our shift number 3 is we want to move from mission to commission. In other words, we want to value the commission, the great commission, which is our partnership with Jesus, more than any, kind of solo mission that we think we might be on. Now, it's true that we're never really solo. We're never really on our own. Jesus is with us. He's promised to be with us. But in that Great Commission, what Jesus is actually promising is that I will be with you in a unique and special way when you are involved in doing what I'm doing in the world. So just listen to the language of the Great Commission. First of all, our part is to make disciples by going, by baptizing, and by teaching to obey. Now, Jesus's part in the next verse is, I will be with you. In other words, God has commanded us to make disciples, but Jesus has promised to be with us in the process and to work through that process. Now, when I understand that, when I understand that I am on a journey with Jesus, I'm on a mission with God, not just for God, that brings steel, you see, to my backbone. That brings courage, that brings encouragement, that brings all kinds of things that help me in trying to make disciples. So as you begin to cultivate relationships, develop experiences, make disciples, remember these 3 principles of relationship. You want to prioritize imitation over information. You want to value relationships over program, and you want to move from mission to commission. Let me just say that we are going to be meeting in the next couple weeks at our mid-year huddle, which is always a very rich time of interaction. You get to hear from each other, and I think this will be especially rich because of what we did this past semester and its focus on discipleship. But I want to encourage you to review this in a day or 2 before you come to that, because we will actually use some of the material we've talked about here in our discussion when we're all together in a couple weeks.